Welcome to the fourth in the series of second modernity seminars. Individually and together, these classes explore the proposition that we are in a new period of architectural practice and a new period for society, for the global society, worthy of identifying as being distinct from previous periods. Specifically, this period of 21st century modernism and modernity is worthy, it's different enough from what came before to warrant identifying it as being something different. The earlier theory of history, presented by people like Charles Jenks, and we'll get into this, he said that the period of modernity ended in 1973, and he not only pinpointed it to a specific year, he pinpointed it to a day and a month, and actually to the second. He said the moment that they exploded the buildings at Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Missouri, that's the moment when, it was this book, Postmodern Architecture, sorry it's so small. It was that moment, in the introduction to that book, he identifies this as the moment when modernism ended. When the project of modern design in order to do good for society failed, and it failed in a spectacular way. And he said this is the moment when we started to question the ability for modern design specifically and the modern attitude more generally to actually offer benefits to humanity came into question, and the conclusion was no, it's best just to blow it up and replace it with something else. Since then, and some of you have seen the movie The Pruitt-Igoe Myth. How many people who weren't forced to see it last semester saw that movie, Pruitt-Igoe Myth? Okay, I recommend it. It basically revisits this whole story and points out that actually, when people moved into these buildings, they were ecstatic. They thought they had died and gone to heaven, quote unquote. They loved it. It wasn't the problem of design. At best, they loved the design. At worst, they couldn't care less about the design. But when it failed, it certainly was not entirely a problem of design. It was a problem of public policy first and foremost. But ever since then, and before then, architects have been deluded into thinking that we can solve the world's problems with design, and if to the extent that the world has problems, it's because we didn't do good enough in designing it. One of the things we'll be looking at is that design is very important, yes, but it's not the only thing. As a matter of fact, design in and of itself is not worth much. And a lot has happened since this moment to define the way we educate architects. And for several decades after this moment, you could either be a good designer and do good architecture, or you could solve problems. But you can't do both. That was the attitude that guided my education as an architect. And many of your instructors were guided by a similar education. So there's bound to be some residual hints of that left in your educations. Have you seen any signs of that? You can think about it. But fortunately, or for better or worse, the problems of the world are so significant in the 21st century, and so many of them are the result of the solutions of the 20th century that we are increasingly forced into a position where design is part of it. Design was part of the problem, yes, And so design has to be a part of the solution. And so there's a whole new attitude. I suspect you're aware of it more than me in some ways, but I sense a new attitude in your generation of wanting to not just design good buildings that look pretty, but also designing buildings that work well and do good things in the context of the challenges that we're facing in the world globally. And so there's evidence of a new attitude, and that is part of the thesis behind the second modernity. There's also evidence of the crumbling of postmodernity, and in a piece I wrote that you will be reading for Tuesday, I place the moment of the crumbling of postmodernity as specifically as Charles Jenks did. I don't have a report on what time it was when this happened, but I pinpointed at the utterance of a graduate student in Chicago at a specific time and place. I'll let you read that for yourselves. Now, what's some of the other evidence of things changing between the 20th century and the 21st century? Well, Bruce Mau, who was the designer of Rem Koolhaas's Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large book, he's a graphic designer, but he is also a big thinker. And he mounted this exhibition, this traveling exhibition, and a large book published in 2004 called Massive Change. And in it, he documents very convincingly the power of, basically the power of designers to mobilize change. And one of the biggest things he identifies is what I've already spoken about, the power of visual evidence. How many people have heard the name Edward Tufte? One? Okay, Edward Tufte is who?
He's, I guess you could almost call him also sort of a graphic artist, but he had a big thing about like PowerPoints and stuff. That's how really remember that.
Yes, he hates PowerPoints. I hope I'm living up to the standards he set in that seminal piece. This is a graphic depiction. How many people have seen this? Have you ever seen this? So if you've seen this, you've probably heard of Edward Tufte, you just don't remember his name. Edward Tufte is the father of information design as distinct from graphic design. Information design has at its core the premise that the information that you're presenting is important, but the way you present it is as or more important than the information itself. The way you present the information will determine an awful lot about what that information ends up meaning to other people. And so this is the classic example that he offers at the beginning of his first of, I think, 4 books now. You can take a seminar with Edward Tufte, but it costs, I think, $300 now for an all-day seminar. But you get his beautiful books. But his books are very important for architects. I recommend it highly. Buying the books is cheaper than attending the seminar. Checking the books out from the library is even cheaper than that. But he also has a website. But you spell his name Tufte. So this is showing the march of Napoleon's army across Prussia towards Moscow. And the width of the line is an indication of how many soldiers are in his force. And this was a brutal winter. And so with every few miles traveled, and this is a map. So maps are often the most rich graphic analysis tools that we've developed as a society. Maps from the beginning of cartography have always tried to depict things, not just the physical features of a landscape, but so much more, the human dimensions and what things mean. And so it's not surprising that this map portrays simultaneously the spatial dimensions of this march, but also the physical number of soldiers and other things as well. The temperature at the time, it was very cold. It warmed up a bit, and it got colder. The colder it got, the more people died. They were also fighting a defending army as well. But you can see from the most dramatic messages, a lot of people started out this march. Not many people came back alive. And so this was basically a very clear depiction of something that all this information could be in a spreadsheet. But what good is it in a spreadsheet? It's when you visualize it that it really has impact. And that was the premise put forward by Bruce Mau in this book. And since that picture didn't turn out, we'll just keep it here. But this is a graphic depiction of the internet at the time in 2004. And ever since then, there's been a lot of activity around visualizing the dimensions and the dynamics of the internet, which of course has gotten thicker and bigger and more complex every week since then. But this is basically a book about presenting visual and physical evidence in a way that proves to be extremely convincing, and things that are capable of producing sudden and massive change in response to the sudden and massive challenges that we are facing. And so it's all about how design can do this. And there have been a whole bunch of other books that I could bring to your attention if you are not already aware of them. The books that come out of Architecture for Humanity, the books about how the Design for the Other 90%, which just had its second installment at the UN these past few months. The Rural Studio of Mockbee down in Alabama. It's kind of, some would say there's a shift in attention. Suddenly, designers and specifically architects are paying attention to these types of design endeavors that are actually going to produce some real, tangible progress in terms of human welfare. Now, this shouldn't seem so strange and so new. Because the very early days of modernism was very much about bringing the unprecedented benefits of new technologies and new democratic institutions to the greatest number of people. As a matter of fact, this in the past has been identified as the essence of modernity. In prior eras, there was a king, and if you were born a peasant farmer, you would die a peasant farmer. And there really wasn't anything anyone could do to change that. And if you were born a king, you would die a king or a deposed king. So you were born into a social position and it wouldn't move. It's basically, that was it. And it was very solidly defined, and there was nothing you could do. But with the dawning of the Industrial Revolution, and it's not just a technological change and a change in the physical resources of humanity, it's a change in the political institutions. There has been, since the Enlightenment, starting around the middle of the 18th century, a shift in the attitudes of societies away from fixed hierarchical structures to a more open-ended age of reason, where you would advance or decline depending on the value you offer to society. So the ideas of meritocracy are brought into play. The ideas of logic and reason and scientific progress are brought in. And you advance or decline depending on your capacity to offer something towards the larger advancement of society. And in this change, since the dawn of the Enlightenment, it's been at least two things going on. One is how human societies operate, and the second is what is the technological capacity of human societies to feed, clothe, house, and make a larger amount of resources available to the most number of people possible. And so by the dawn of the 20th century, the modern era was in full swing, less so in the architecture of modernism, but human societies more generally across the globe were fully engaged in the project of the modern period. And the project of the modern period is really about offering the greatest benefits to the greatest numbers of people. And by the time architecture gets fully into the act, that is very clearly the idea. You've taken history of architecture, and so you probably recognize images that look like this. Do you recognize this? This is a group of architects during a period of great financial hardship in Germany. There really were no commissions because of the economic trauma of war, World War I. And so between the wars, they kept busy by creating these visions. And this is the vision I've chosen. This is one of the chapters of the history of modern architecture that most clearly identifies the potential for architecture, or at least the promise of architecture. And what they were doing is they were envisioning, because they were architects and were uniquely skilled at offering a clear vision of what the future might be like if we act in certain ways. And so they were creating these visions, these utopian visions, in order to influence other people and try to make it come to pass the way they are envisioning it. And so the specifics of their vision are not necessarily important, but I'm going to share it with you just to give you a sense of how ambitious they were and how serious they were about doing things that went way beyond satisfying the programmatic needs of their clients, coming in on time and on budget, making use of the most recent technological advances. All of these things were part of what they were doing. As a matter of fact, the fundamental transformative act that they identified was the introduction of large sheets of glass into buildings. And they saw this technological change as being the key to transforming humanity. And so by abandoning the historical brick cities with small panes of glass, leaving those cities behind and moving into the Alps, they would create these new cities that were cities of glass. It was like the Wizard of Oz. It was like Oz. And these cities of glass would be crystalline in nature. These faceted glass cities, megastructures, that would emulate the peaks of the Alps themselves and grow out of the mountains. And the shock of these new forms and the sheer delight that they would offer in terms of the scintillating, glistening city and the play of light, that would be enough to convince people, similar to the way the Gothic cathedrals were mobilized to convince people of God's greatness. People living with thatched roofs, with doing everything in one room, rats living in the ceiling of the thatched roof, and then they would walk to the main town and enter the Gothic cathedrals of Europe and have the ceiling, 300 feet above them, and the light shining in, colored glass. I mean, these cathedrals were intended to shock people into realizing God's greatness, and it was a sampling of what lied ahead in heaven, and it was supposed to change their lives and make them into devout Christians working towards earning a place in heaven. And to a large extent, that's exactly what the Gothic cathedrals did. If they didn't do it through an experiential thing, it was very convincing to see how serious the church was. How else could they build such impossible structures as the Gothic cathedrals? So similarly, the glass architects, the glass chain architects, saw the promise of the new technologies of architecture to transform humanity. Humanity was predestined to make a certain degree of progress, but that progress was going to be catalyzed and accelerated and guided in a specific direction because of the awesome power of architecture. So it was about the technological changes in architecture, but it wasn't just about the technological changes of architecture. It was about powerful design, but it was powerful design mobilized as a vehicle for something much bigger. And so the vision of the new world was something much bigger than simply what we're used to, the pedestrian ambitions of architecture. And so this was at the heart of what modern architecture promised in the beginning of the 20th century. And you could look at the Italian futurists, and assuming that you have you looked at these things? Have you studied the history of modern architecture? Imagine my... What? You're seniors, right? And you took it last summer? Or you took it with me?
Last summer.
Over the summer.
Oh, last summer.
It kind of went from like the 1800s in industrial architecture to building with like earth forms and stuff.
Okay. All right.
Tires. Yeah.
We'll have to wait for me to turn off the recording device to have this discussion. So, there at the beginning of the 20th century, so the 40-second version of what I hope you had studied, I bet you did. I bet you studied this. The 42-second version of that is the Italian Futurists, the German Expressionists, the glass chain, De Stijl, Bauhaus. In Spain, there was, in France, there was Art Nouveau. There were movements, the arts and crafts movement. Each of these movements tended to flourish in a specific country in Europe. But each of them had this similar basis. Architecture was going to become a vehicle for dramatic and rapid transformation of humanity. And to a certain extent, that's what happened. Or that's what began to happen, and then the two world wars intervened, caused a lot of fear to displace the hope that had existed prior to the wars. And with all that fear sweeping through, something else happened. There was an alternative outcome to the story. And that was the elevation of, there was kind of a pooling of all the ideas of modern architecture and their connections to social benefits. And that happened at the the International Congress of Modern Architecture, SIAM. I've heard of SIAM. Raise your hand. SIAM, C-I-A-M. International. Okay. So another 40-second version of high modernism. After World War II, Europe lay in ruins, all these architects are still floating around trying to figure out what to do with themselves. They've got lots of big ideas. And so they got together every year or so, and they said, okay, we've got this post-war situation. We've got to rebuild. What's the blueprint? And they pulled out the blueprint from 1933. Le Corbusier. Yes. Led the team to write the Bible of how to build cities and architecture. It was called the Athens Charter. And the Athens Charter basically laid out a very handy, convenient blueprint of how to rebuild Europe. And it took on a life of its own. Corbusier is kind of onto his other things, relaxing. And this whole Athens Charter vision for the world took on a life of its own. And here we go. Athens Charter visions, another utopian vision, not so different, a little more pragmatic, but no less transformative. It doesn't look so strange to us now because we look out the window and, oh yeah, okay, now the tree's a little more, yeah, right there. Okay, perfect. It's a pretty close match. But at the time, this was as radical as this. It was weird. It was bizarre. It was unlikely as hell. And yet, the ideas sank into people's minds partly because the power of images like this. It made sense. It was replicable. But more than anything else, it matched what the industrial capacity of the victorious powers were capable of achieving after World War II. It also matched the kind of project that the powerful centralized governments were capable of performing in service to the masses after World War II. And so this vision, married to this thing that we now call the welfare state of the post-war period, culminated in this complex thing that goes beyond just the design of buildings. It was a very much unified thing of the post-war, high modern welfare state. The blueprints of this were successful in the reconstruction of Europe, and because the Nazis and the Japanese didn't bomb they didn't bomb any of the continental United States, and we wanted the same thing that we were paying for in Europe, so we bombed our own cities. This entire neighborhood where we are now was bulldozed and destroyed as completely as the cities of Europe were destroyed. Parts of the cities of Europe were destroyed by bombs. And we built this, and we built it here, and we built it in Europe, because we paid for it, by the way. And that's why this is such a familiar, comfortable image. And it continues to be built all over the world, even now, in the name of global development of the developing world. But turns out there are problems with this. One of them is the limited resources of a finite planet. And in this image, evoked the idea of a spaceship Earth. That up until, for most of human history, the evidence was very clear that you could farm and fish and extract resources from the planet, and there was more than enough. And it reinforced the message from Christianity. Nature is there to be exploited, and it all worked. It was a very workable system until we got really too good at extracting the resources, and we came up against the limitations of a finite planet. This gets more into Bruce Mao stuff. So we started to run into trouble after World War II, and to make a long story short, we now are facing planetary destruction. Sorry about that. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to be dead, but what are you guys going to do about the destruction of the planet? So I've been sent by my generation to talk to you and say, don't panic. It looks pretty bad, but maybe there's something we can do. Back in the 20th century, you might remember back then, it was something like this. Design was just this little thing, that the marketing department would have designers, and the marketing department was inside the business, the corporation, and the corporation operated within a system of governance and regulations and taxation, and that happened within, you get the picture, that there are these ever-enclosing circles, and design is at the very center. And designers are given a very specific task. Sell more cigarettes. Wow the clients. Put Bilbao on the map. Make it so Bilbao is a household name. So architects are given very specific tasks to perform. And they're limited. Architects are not supposed to solve the problems of the world. Architects are supposed to solve very specific problems that are assigned to us. Well, Bruce Mao has been one of the people who have articulated this quite clearly, that the problems that we have inherited in the 21st century are to a large extent the solutions we have inherited from the 20th century. When we said, what's the best way to get from point A to point B, we said, I don't know, that's a hard question. We need to give that to the experts. Who's the expert on how to get from point A to point B? The transportation engineers. So we say, hey, transportation engineers, what's the best way to get from point A to point B? And they said, roads. And we said, okay, build us roads. And they built us roads. Let's see, where's the picture? And the logical outcome, the logical conclusion of whenever there's too much traffic and not enough parking, you should build more roads and build more parking lots. You end up with something like this. This is Houston, Texas, which is currently choked with traffic jams. It turns out that the geometry of the automobile doesn't really work. The more roads you make, the more driving occurs, the worse the traffic jams get. Even billions of dollars of investment in roads, it just makes the problem worse every time those investments happen. It doesn't make sense, but that's the reality that history teaches us. And so by giving a very narrow problem to a set of experts to solve without thinking of the other issues results in sometimes it results in unintended consequences. The secondary impacts of our solutions are things like nuclear waste, global climate change, traffic jams, childhood asthma, cancer, etc. So the biggest problems, if you look at the biggest problems that are occurring in the 21st century, very, very few of them have natural origins. They are pretty much man-made, and they're pretty much, if we hadn't been so damn successful in the 20th century solving our problems, we wouldn't have these problems in the 21st century. So the problems of the 21st century are to a large extent the secondary impacts, the unintended consequences of our solutions from the 20th century. And so if the solutions of the 20th century were offered us by experts who were given a very narrow definition of the problem, how can we avoid that in the future? Well, if you think about it, not just because we're architects, the obvious answer is architects. Well, maybe it is because we're architects. But it's not so crazy. What do architects do? we take the expert output of very narrowly defined problems by engineers, structural engineers, environmental engineers, mechanical engineers, etc. All of these technical experts are feeding their solutions to the architect. It's the architect's job to make sense of them in balance with each other, while still maintaining a sense of the larger ambitions of the client. In some cases, the client is a public client. An entire city could be the client. And the architect and the design methodology requires us to balance all of these seemingly conflicting things and somehow resolve them together in a design. That's why they hire architects. If we didn't do that, there would be no need for us. They would just take the input of the engineers, and actually, when the problems are simple, that's what they do, and they do just fine. You take the input of the structural engineer and the mechanical engineer, and you put it in the building. You don't need an architect, unless the problems are seemingly tough. When you get things that seem to be impossible, that's when you need the design method. You need to somehow float all of these different issues in the air and make sense of them and bring them together and reconcile the seeming contradictions into something that sorts them out, some approach or some idea that places them in the proper order and resolves in a unified, comprehensive design that somehow avoids the problems that wouldn't even be caught if it's just the structural engineer giving the solution, or just the transportation engineer giving the solution. We no longer design transportation systems simply from the input of transportation engineers. We get designers and community participation and political leaders and sociologists and psychiatrists, and there's a whole team that are not considering just the technical aspects. They're considering the psychological, cultural, human issues of gender equality and race equality. All of these things come into play, of universal design, in something as simple as designing Ruggles Station. That was a collaborative process that is much closer to this model than it was to this model. And so we are shifting gears. Even business schools are starting to offer design studios, because business schools have the benefit of not caring how you get to the right answer. The business school cares about getting to that answer before anyone else does and figuring out a way to make money out of it. And there's something refreshing about that. If someone comes to them and says, hey, why don't you try teaching your business classes as a design studio? Their proper response is, that's for the design school. They're down the hall. Go down there, talk to them. But if you go to the business school and you say, hey, in a design studio, you can catch the problems that in the normal way of doing business you wouldn't recognize until you get to production or marketing. In a design studio, using the design methodology, you can identify these things early in the product development, early in the business model development, and save yourself a lot of time and money and be more successful and have a competitive advantage over people using the old traditional method. What does Stanford Business School say? They say, okay, here's a new wing to our business school. It's filled with design schools. It's yours. It's filled with design studios for business students. Go ahead. Yale, business school after business school are starting to build design studios because of this. The Netherlands is a special case. Some of you have heard about it. One of the highest population densities in the world for a very large land area. Singapore is more dense, but it's smaller than Boston. The Netherlands is more like California, very high population density. And it's below sea level. So starting in the 8th century, floods were coming in and killing vast numbers of people. They couldn't afford to do that. They either had to leave or take control of the situation. They chose to take control of the situation. They built dikes, but more importantly, they built social arrangements such that, let's say there are 23 people in a room, and each of us has a segment of the dike. And it's surrounding where we all have our farms and our houses. Who's the most important person in that room? Not the mayor. The most important person in the room is the one who's not keeping his dike in proper order. They're the most important person in the room because they're the one who is threatening the existence of the town. And so you very quickly, it's the opposite of a Tea Party, it's the opposite of the libertarian movement. You very quickly develop collective social relationships. And you make sure that he comes to the party and says, so George, how's your dike? I don't have to do anything. No, George, we're all depending on you, George. Nah, it's fine. George, let's go, George. We're going to go fix your dike. So it becomes a collectivist arrangement, and it's you either do that or you get flooded out. So it's do or die at the scale of an entire nation. And so the Dutch have developed these remarkable approaches to design problems, which have now become world famous, especially in architecture schools. Rem Koolhaas is very much a product of the Dutch mentality, and he's helped draw attention to it. The Dutch landscape, about the size of Los Angeles. I apologize to the two of you who've seen this before. About the size of Los Angeles, the Southern California basin. The economy is about the same size. The red shows the towns. There's Rotterdam, The Hague, Delft. Where am I? Come back. It's going to come. Thank you. Amsterdam, Haarlem. So it's a ring of cities around an agricultural heart. And so as time goes by, in order to keep the food supply up, they concentrate their development in the cities. Here we are. So this is 1850, 100 years later, 1940. They filled in a lot of the water bodies to create more agricultural land. And they've controlled development, they've restricted development to certain centers to keep the farmland open. And even in 1970, and even as far as 2000, with dramatic rapid expansion of the population and the spreading out of the population to a certain extent, but still maintaining open space to continue to have agricultural lands and the ability for flooding to occur in a way that protects the houses. If you give the water a place to go, it won't flood the cities. And so the open landscape is very much a flood control survival measure. And so the same view of Los Angeles would be all kind of an even wash of pink, medium density, crisscrossed by urban freeways. This is a system of intercity rails. There are freeways, yes, but it's predominantly a rail system. And I'm about to go to a conference in Delft, and I'm going to stay with my friends in Haarlem. And instead of renting a car, I'm just going to hop on the train and take the train and maybe a bicycle, rent a bicycle at the train station, and go to the conference. And then at night I'll go back. And if it were LA, it'd be a two-hour drive because that's about 70 miles. But with the train system, the train's traveling at 90 miles an hour or 120 miles an hour. It's great. And it's basically designed so you can go to a meeting anywhere in the Netherlands and at that night sleep in your own bed. You don't. That's how effective the rail system works. So Rem Koolhaas helped us understand this. Here's an example of data visualization. In 1995, the National Housing Board of the Netherlands declared that they needed to build 85,000 new homes in the next few decades in order to house the population. The Netherlands at the time was privatizing its arrangements just the way the United States and a lot of other nations were. And they were saying, people want to live in single-family houses the way they do in the United States. A lot of people are moving to Belgium in order to live in single-family houses. Why don't we open up the landscape and allow single-family houses to spread out across this agricultural land, increase the value of the land? Yeah, we'll have to import more food. We'll be more prone to flooding, but these are market forces. Let's follow the market forces. And so this architect, who's become a landscape architect, West 8, Adrian Krause, did a data visualization. He said, what does 85,000 houses look like? And so, oh, I'm sorry, I got the numbers wrong. 800,000 houses. Important difference. So what do 800,000 single-family houses look like? Let's take a look. And it doesn't matter how you arrange them. The ultimate impact is, hey, that's a lot of houses. And so the message that was very visibly demonstrated using Missouri rules was not such a good idea. It's best to stay compact in cities. And so what does this have to do with the focus of this course, which is the new capacity for relationships that are mobilized by the information and communication technology revolutions? Where's the connection between the Netherlands and all the stuff I've been talking about and what we're going to spend most of our time in this course talking about? I propose, we only have a half hour left, right? Is that true? Okay. Do you need a break? It's hot in here, isn't it? Well, if I were you, I would want to know where this is going in terms of really what we're going to be doing this semester. So what if we just stick it out, just push through? Is that okay? Do you have any questions? Like someone should say, what? Do you have any questions? Okay. So some of the weird things that architects were drawing at the beginning of the 20th century, it just wasn't possible to build them, like those glass cities in the mountains. But all of a sudden, it is possible to build them. And all the things we did after World War II in the period of high modernism that we then called into question during the period of what we called at the time postmodernism. Postmodernism is really, I encourage you to think of it as post-high modernism. There's a larger trajectory of modernism, and then there's the short periods of other things. High modernism after World War II, the sum total of all the evidence of all the problems that were created by high modernism added up to a strong argument that we should stop doing this and find something else to do. But first we had to stop doing it. And so we emphasized what it wasn't. And so we called it postmodernism to emphasize we're not going to do this anymore. But now that we're stepping back and we're looking at the larger scope of history, what we should be seeing is that this is still the modern period. And there was a period of high modernism and postmodernism. In a way, we are reconnecting the lost threads that interrupted the progression of modern architectural explorations when the world wars hit. And so here we go. This seems to have a lot more to do with the glass chain German expressionists of the crystalline cities in the mountains than it does with the Salk Institute. And so here we are. One idea of what's happening now is we are revisiting the roots of modernism. And we're doing it with a new set of tools. Not only are the new set of tools allowing us to build things that we could never build before, but we can solve problems and approach things outside of architecture in ways that we never could have prior to this moment. And so the obvious starting point for this class is this new capacity for designing and building forms that challenge the assumptions of prior ages. And these projects are probably familiar to you, maybe not this one. But it's kind of a new vision of the future. But what keeps this from becoming just another, what is there to keep this from being just another incremental advance in the formal expression of architecture? And that's really what this class is about, is what are the deeper underpinnings and potential and possibility. So we did all this. The reading for next Tuesday is from here. It's this, the piece I wrote, which kind of summarizes, it came out of the first two classes on second modernity. This will be on Blackboard. And it basically establishes a foundation upon which we can now build. The two things I would like you to take note of, one of them is in here. The first thing I would like you to take note of is the word reflexivity. It turns out that one of the positions that this class is testing is that the key element of the second period of modernity is embedded in this word reflexivity. If you look it up, I recommend looking it up in Wikipedia. The reflexivity of social theory, the social theory meaning of reflexivity, is probably the one that makes the most sense to look at. But the simplest idea of reflexivity is in the idea of the thermostat. The doctor hits your knee with a hammer, and your reflex response is your foot kicks up. It doesn't kick up because your brain says, okay, now it's time to kick your foot up. No, it just happens. It's an automatic response. You don't have to think about it. It just happens. This idea of reflexivity is something we're going to look at in the course. That it's something that happens automatically. And in architecture, this is a hint at the kind of things that we run into in architecture. Architects already operate through reflexive systems. Systems that demonstrate some of the characteristics of reflexivity. and I'm thinking, of course, of the thermostat. If we had a properly designed system in this room, the thermostat would reflexively adjust the temperature to keep this room in the comfort zone in terms of temperature at the very least. But the reflexive mechanisms of this room have been dismantled or turned off or something. It's not working. And so reflexive mechanisms don't, the knee is something that happens just naturally, biologically. When you hear a tiger roar behind your left ear, really close to you, your body knows what to do. You run. It's biologically programmed. It's automatically set up. Other things we set up. I teach my children not to run into the street after the ball. And they are really good at that. I say to them, here's the stop line, and I drag my foot, zip, 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 and I take the ball, and I say, okay, here's the ball, and I roll it out in the street, and they run up to me and go, boom, and they stop, because they have established a reflex mechanism, that it is a learned thing. It was designed, and it was constructed, and it requires maintenance to keep it going. Every once in a while, I see them go, they're going, and I say, zip, zip, zip. And it's like, we also, if you've had a dog, you know about reflexive responses. So this is an attribute of a system behavior. The reflex response of the knee is a natural reflex. The system response of the stop line with my children, or the stay with my dog, or the thermostat in my architecture, these are reflexive systems that are established, they are designed, they are constructed, and they are maintained. And when something goes wrong, we have to, it's no longer automatic. When it starts to operate in a way that causes negative consequences, we should go and change it. We should evaluate it critically and fix it. Now, this is an analogy that we will be referring to all semester. So it's probably the most important thing to get out of the reading for Tuesday, is what is this idea of reflexivity? And a lot of other things are in this piece, that some of them you've heard in this lecture. Sorry for the repetition. But there will be lots of new stuff. And there will be references to the literature that, you might find some of these things useful, but it's all optional. Each of you will be identifying an area of your own personal interest, and together we will start to explore the possibilities within that area of interest. And together and individually, we will be developing those threads that hopefully will stand on their own and come together into a book. There's another idea that is closely related to reflexivity that is contained in the word metis. But I think I'm going to leave that until next time. Or at least, until next time. But here's an overview of how things might be playing out. Right now, the roadmap that I've laid out takes us from reflexivity across this territory. And this territory will change. We start with reflexivity. We'll move to a study that, have you heard of this word, phenomenology? Where's it come up? Landscape? I'd be very interested to hear what that discussion was about. On Thursday, a week from today, if you can just refresh your memory of what you talked about as being phenomenological, that'd be great. From there, we will go more directly into some of the things that you expect from a senior seminar elective in architecture school. What is this new thing going on in architecture, this parametric design? These buildings that move when I walk past it. These bizarre forms that make me feel simultaneously delighted and a little frightened. What is going on with this stuff? And so we'll be looking at that. And those of you who feel comfortable in that area, I would encourage you to move out of that comfort zone. But you can reserve the right to stay firmly anchored there. We'll be moving into something called sociography, which is very much a clear extension of phenomenology. Human bodies occupy space. The shape of the space has a lot to do with the way we occupy that space. And when people are in a space, it changes the space. And so there's this very rich and interesting interaction between space and people that have been studied over the centuries. But as new technologies become available, we are capable of studying it in new and richer ways. And so we'll be looking at some of that in this thing. And then to go from the clouds and the speculation of theories of sociography, we come crashing down to Earth. If you want to talk about human bodies in space, here we go. Traffic. It happens all day long, every day. Human bodies interacting in space, mediated by the built environment of streets and sometimes with vehicles. And you want to talk about reflexes. Try texting your significant other while driving in Boston. You're thinking about, oh, I forgot it's your birthday. Hey, don't cut me off. Zoom, red light, yellow light, bicyclists, pedestrians, jaywalking. This is, if it wasn't reflexive, there'd be a lot more death and mayhem. But fortunately, human beings are highly trainable, and we can be focusing on what we're going to have for dinner and still drive at 40 or 50 miles an hour through a crowded urban landscape, and hardly anyone gets killed. It's very rare, right? Does that amaze anyone but me? I'm like blown away. How can so few people die when, if you really think about it, okay? Traffic. Anything we thought we knew up until this point, this is going to be kind of a wake-up call because it's really happening there. The games people play. I don't know if you've heard about this, but you can measure your heart rate. You knew that, right? When you go running or bicycling or swimming. How many people have done that? Yeah. So you measure your heart rate and you stay in your zone and you get a good workout. Did you know that some people are doing that? Are any of you doing that right now? No, not with your finger like that. With your iPhone. Some people, not far from here, are developing a data record of their heart rates and their breathing rates, how many steps they're taking, how many calories they're eating, how many calories they're burning. We're not quite at the point where we're measuring how many thoughts we're thinking. But some people are recording everything that can possibly be recorded about the human organism. And if you want to change something, measure it, right? How many people have heard that? If you want to change something, measure it, quantify it, and then set up a game, set up goals. This woman, McGonagall, she hit her head and she was getting suicidal. Have you heard of her? And she invented a video game that saved her life and is now changing other people's lives. You set up a goal, you measure it, and you change yourself through this video game, computer interactive thingy. It's not just people, it's also cities. Cities are changing. It used to be, hey, there's a pothole in front of my house. And they'll say, hey, write a letter. If you can ever get anyone on the phone, they'll say, write a letter. And so you write a letter and you never hear anything from it. This has changed. Now you pull out your smartphone, not this one, but you take a picture of the pothole, it geolocates it on Google Earth, and pow, it shows up as a dot in City Hall. But wait, we're beyond that. Now you just turn on your road condition reporter and you just drive around the city doing your stuff. Every time you hit a pothole, the accelerometer goes pothole, and you don't hear it say pothole, but someone in City Hall does. And so there's someone sitting in a room in City Hall someday soon in a City Hall near you, and they're just watching the map and saying, pothole, 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 pothole. And the map is filling up with live, real-time reporting of every pothole that anybody with this turned on hits. And so you don't even have to stop, get out, take a picture of the pothole. It happens. So here's an example of someone designing an automatic system response. When the pothole reports add up and looks like a lot of pothole reports right here, the team is dispatched and they fix the worst pothole that the most people hit in the last 24 hours. And it becomes an automatic system response. It becomes a reflexive mechanism that improves the performance of cities and makes it possible, makes the world a better place at a much lower cost. And the lower cost thing is the biggest thing. We Americans hate government. We want to kill it. I'm generalizing. But there's an awful lot of anger. Let's kill that government until it's dead, dead, dead. They do nothing but waste our money. Well, what if the government, big government, were put out of business by reflexive government? And there's a lot of people looking at that too. That's all in the area of what we're going to look at in games people play. Cybernetics comes in somewhere, I'm not sure where. Social engagements. This gets back to Bruce Mao, massive change. There are things that we can now do that we never could do before because of these new attributes of reflexivity, that we can help improve conditions and spread the benefits more widely because we have new capacity. We'll have a guest lecturer in Bill Bean. Do you know Bill Bean? Has anyone taken his social engagements class? Okay. Networked space, one of the biggest things that in architecture these days is how do we deal with the new realities of networked space. A lot of people thinking and writing about it, not so successfully. This is going to be a challenge to do justice to this topic, but I'm working on it. And finally, in the 10th week of this process, the challenge will be to bring it all together, sew up the loose threads, and figure out where we're going with this. Okay. Questions?